Oh, hey, Sean. It's nice to meet you.
Hey, Thomas. Nice to meet you. Thanks for taking a few minutes to chat with Real Clear Live.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So first of all, obviously the holidays are coming up, and lots of people are thinking about giving money to charities. I just wanted to ask you, what are some things that people should look for when choosing a charity to donate to?
Well, I think you're right. It's such a nice sentiment and a sentimental time of year, and people are encouraged in the holiday season to do it, and it's wonderful. I think it's for me. I think working in a nonprofit, Direct Relief, understanding there's so many other compelling causes. I think it's important for people to decide what they personally care about, and whether it's animal welfare, or the environment, or arts, or education, or humanitarian health services, in Direct Relief's case. But then once you decide what you want to put your resources behind, and do a little homework to make sure that you found an organization that's going to do it well with your money. And I think that's an important part of it. There are independent kind of consumer rating organizations exclusively for nonprofits like Charity Navigator that provide that service to the public, and they make it easy to kind of see how groups are rated and ranked, and how they manage their money, and that's an important piece of it at this time of year as well.
Great. And I looked at your site, and it looks like Direct Relief is doing some amazing work for people. But then I've also read a little bit about this effective altruism idea, and guys like Oxford professor Will McCaskill, who has said that people shouldn't donate to disaster relief because that money could help many more people affected by ongoing natural disasters like lack of drinking water, or malaria, or deadly worm diseases in Africa. What are your thoughts on that when someone says something like that?
Well, I think Direct Relief does both. I think it tends to be, as you said, these certain emergencies rivet attention. For whatever reason, they cut through the public consciousness, and I think it caused people. The Haiti earthquake was one. The Nepal earthquake was one. The Japanese tsunami was one. I think these major events, the Ecuador earthquake last year, not so much. I think in a way, sometimes that spurs so much giving, the money isn't productively spent. And it's frustrating in retrospect, and it causes people to retrench and be a bit skeptical. So I think there's some legitimacy to question whether the money spent in emergencies is always spent most productively. I've personally been in a bunch of them, and it's not across the board. However, I think it's also a bit of a false distinction to say that just working on the chronic issues is important, because in many cases, the biggest impediment to making advances on these areas of chronic poverty are big emergencies that tend to disproportionately affect poor people who have less cushion. Nepal, for example, where we've been very active for years, I think, in building the infrastructure to connect the country, and what Direct Relief has worked on an ongoing basis is midwifery, safe deliveries for women. Now, when the earthquake comes, it broke the system. The infrastructure was deeply damaged. It really hurt the health system. So it was important at that time, I think, to focus on rebuilding that. So I think in general, you don't want to just pour money into something that's on the news, but also recognize that that is a bit of a false distinction, because the impediment to making traction against chronic problems, particularly in poor areas, are these major disasters that cause big setbacks. So I think in Direct Relief's case, we work most often on an ongoing basis. We happen to get most of our attention in the high-profile emergencies. So I definitely understand the argument and think there's legitimacy to it, but I think it's also a bit of a false distinction to say it's one or the other, because I think they often affect the same areas disproportionately. Both poverty and emergencies are intensified in poor areas. Does that make sense? Sorry if it's a good question.
No, that's a great answer. And what are your thoughts on I've read a little bit about the so-called meta charities like doing what we can and the life you can save, which they don't donate money to, to one particular cause, but they just encourage people to donate to charity. What do you think about those organizations?
Yeah, I mean, I think the sentiment, it's one of the defining characteristics of the human species is this notion of empathy and altruism, or doing something that is not in necessarily your narrow personal self-interest, and not to forget that. I mean, that's why I think my colleagues work at Direct Relief. I think it's this wonderful notion, and it's very compelling. However, because it's so compelling, sometimes it's prone to be exploited, because you can play upon those emotions, and not, although a cause may be compelling, not everything done in the cause's name is done well. And so I think it's good to have thoughtful people continue to remind us that although yes, robots and artificial intelligence, the advances in technology are amazing, let's not forget it's always been true, that some people are born into less fortunate circumstances. You can't make money off of every endeavor, but they're still worth doing. And to look beyond yourself and try to give people some assistance when needed, as well as people who can't speak for themselves, animals and the environment. I think it's a really important thing to remember in a quiet, thoughtful way, that we'd be remiss if we forgot. That would be a horrible, aspect of our species if we forgot that defining characteristic, I think. I'm biased, though. I work at Direct Relief.
Right. So, but just sort of to be clear, you think that these meta charities are worthwhile?
Well, I'm not sure if I know exactly what you're talking about. I think as you described it, kind of the general guidance to engage and to give, if that's what you're talking about, I think is a really important thing to do. I think if it's not prescriptive about how much or to this particular charity, I think that, I would not presume. I'm biased. I work at Direct Relief, but I think I recognize there are other many fine organizations that do good work. I would just say that in general, it's a good thing to do if it's done well. To just sort of say people should all give to charity and expect it's going to work out well, I don't think that is, there's too many lessons to the contrary. So I think it's, but I'm not entirely sure what the meta charities, if it's Pete Seeger, I think some of the encouragement about empathy and compassion and just thoughtful approach to how you spend your time and life and resources, I find those very compelling personally.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. And just finally, because I know we're a little short on time here, I was wondering if you have any sort of like red flags that people should definitely watch out for when thinking of giving to charities, and also if you have a suggestion for like the percentage that a person should try to give in terms of the percentage of what they make.
Well, I think the red flags are always, for me, someone who calls you that and bothers you at home. I think kind of the telemarketing practice, it doesn't seem appropriate. I don't think people should ever feel pressured in their own home by someone who calls them, or something you've never heard of, or trying to strike while the iron's hot on a very emotional thing. I think those are times when, it's worth just spending some time not making an immediate decision and looking at a charity navigator.org type thing to kind of see, is this a legitimate charity? It sounds good, and everything can look good on the internet. And that's an important thing to do so people aren't exploited, and this wonderful sentimental quality that many of us have is not exploited. In terms of how much people can or should, I don't know. I think it's such a personal decision. As a nonprofit that relies exclusively on charitable gifts, it is very humbling when you receive a check from someone that they could have done something else with for themselves or for their children or for someone that they care about. It's like being a trustee to do right by this person's money. And so we're always humbled and thankful for any amount we get. And I have no expectation or entitlement to ever have anyone do that. I'm just always thankful and appreciative that people do whatever they can, and some much more than extraordinary. And, I'll give you one quick example, Sean, where when we had a big flooding in the United States, and we got contributions from people in Haiti to support, and they said, we know how it's actually harder when you have a lot and you end up with nothing. We're used to being poor, and here's my $5, and please make it count for someone in the United States. That's a very meaningful gift and a wonderful trait. And so I remember those things in Nepal when there was an earthquake and we got a $10 contribution directly from someone in Nepal online, said, please help my country. Those things they're not the biggest gifts, but they carry the most weight because you know that they're coming from people who don't have a lot to give but still choose to.
Right. Awesome. Well, thanks so much for taking some time to talk with Real Clear Life. I really appreciate this, and best of luck. I think it's great what you're doing.
Thank you very much, John. Appreciate it.
Okay. Bye.